short before he left for China, we had a farewell meal, very nice meal actually at the local restaurant, Zheng in Jericho. Some of you probably been there. He was quite excited. I remember that, like before he made his first ever trip to China. I never thought this going to too long, I suppose. And we sit at a rectangle shape of dining table. And I think back then, Robert was still a vegetarian. After 4 years of immersing appearance of food sharing culture in one table in China, I don't know whether that's still the case. So anyway, since then we have been working together with Professor Walker on a few projects. He co-edited a manuscript entitled Modernization of Education and Social Governance, published by OPGDI in 2021. As well, he published a timely response to the immediate urgent question that in his paper, who should receive the COVID-19 vaccine first, in October 2020, after the dialogue of the COVID-19 in Conversation series we organized here in this institute. Professor Walker just came back to the UK recently from his visit to US, where I think he is a fellow there at the Schornstein Center for Media and Politics, Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. His principal research currently focuses on the experience of poverty in China during the era of 14th Five-Year Plan. I believe he was also invited by the Premier of China, Chinese government, 2 years in a row to advise on the poverty reduction policy there. And the title of his talk actually today is Poverty Under the World Order. I realize that, my apology, that the title been somehow changed, appeared to be a different title, Poverty and the New World Order, by me probably somewhere else, apology for that. So the floor is yours, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's great to be back here in Oxford. And I've never been in this college before. Isn't it awful? 10 years here. So it's a great opportunity to meet and broaden my contacts with the university. Thank you for all those words. I'm not going to talk about China today, but what I have been thinking about is strongly influenced by my experiences in China. I'm going to talk about poverty in the world order. What's slightly changed is whether it should be New World Order. It began because it's part of a book series produced by Agenda Publishing, and they commissioned a book on each of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are 17 targets that the world has agreed to fulfill by 2030. And they're producing a book on each of those. And I'm doing SDG 1. And when I set out on this book, writing this book, I was confident that I knew something and that we could change and develop and actually meet that goal. I'm afraid the journey of writing this book has been one of dismal disappointment. And as you will find, my conclusion is quite weak. I've got lots of slides, and I'm conscious I've got too much information to share with you in just an hour. So I will skip through the slides, and I'm happy to share the slides with anybody who wants them. And I suppose I should say from the publisher's perspective, and you can read them all when the book is published at the end of the year. That's the end of my advertisements. So the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 1, is the core one. It's about eradicating poverty. My conclusion is we have little hope of achieving that. I want to explain why I think that's the case. I want to share with you policies that we could implement, which could quite readily achieve this particular goal. But in order to do so, my view is that we need to reshape the world order. And that's where, in a sense, we connect back with your interpretation of the book title, because we need a new world order. My concern is that we can't get to that stage either. And so I end up with a dismal conclusion that we should do something, but we probably won't. And I've actually spent my time in Harvard, for 4 months that I've been there, rewriting the back end of the book to try and make it more positive. Not what Harvard expected me to do, but never mind. Okay, so we have within the Sustainable Development Goals a set within them of targets. The first set of targets are about eradicating extreme poverty and reducing other sorts of poverty by half. And we have a set of indicators against which we can assess the performance of the world and individual countries. Part of its problem is it mixes definitions. So we have the proportion of the population living beneath the international poverty line. That's living on less than $1.90 a day. We've got a second target or a second indicator, which is about halving poverty according to national criteria. In much of the developed world, we use a relative definition of poverty. Elsewhere in the world, we use an absolute definition of poverty. We've got a different concept. And then we've got reduce the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages in poverty according to all its dimensions, according to national criteria. The goal within the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 was to embrace the global north and the global south. We'll go back and briefly talk about the Millennium Development Goals, which the North thought was something for the developing world, not for the North. The Sustainable Development Goal was trying to bring the whole world together, set common goals that we could work towards. But with different definitions, we have real problems. We still have major divisions in terms of what we're trying to do. We have a set of implementation targets, which is essentially how we can resolve poverty, how we can eradicate poverty or reduce it by half, depending on what definition you want to try. And then we've got a series of partnership targets, which is saying we can't do this individually, we have to do it together. And much of my conversation will be about doing it together and why we can't do it together. So those are the broad domain. So why do I think we have little hope of fulfilling the goals? I want to look at development from our last experience. I want to look at some of the challenges implicit within the goals that we've actually set. And then to remind ourselves of what the causes of poverty are, and therefore how we should shape policy to address them. So to begin, evidence of the Millennium Development Goals. In 2000, we set an agenda which was aimed at 2015. At that point, we had 8 goals to do with hunger, to do with education, gender, mortality. 8 goals that we set ourselves to have achieved by 2015. This is a sort of official assessment from the United Nations. You can't read it, but what you can take away, I think, is a sense of green. And it's a traffic light system, and the greens indicate which goals and which targets were met under the Millennium Development Goals. And it creates a picture which is broadly green. There are some reds, but essentially a story of success. And it was that story of success which enabled the United Nations to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay? But when you actually look at the official assessment and compare it, which actually comes from our own world, forgive me, I disconnected myself with the whole world out there. Yeah, if we compare, I have disconnected.
Just 1 second.
Whoops. Sorry, folks. I waved my arms around far too much. Okay. Do you want to put it in my pocket? Will it work in my pocket?
I think pocket's better.
Pocket in my pocket. Okay. Sorry about that. When we compare it with our own analysis here in Oxford, we find the story is very different. So here again, we've got our targets down the left-hand side. And we've got what the actual target was in red. And we can see that only about 40% of the targets were actually reached. But it's important to note that halving poverty, measured then as $1 a day, was one where we were pretty successful as a world in terms of addressing that goal. We'll see a little bit more about why that was. If we break it down by regions and look at targets, we can see the only one that didn't meet the poverty in cash target was in sub-Saharan Africa. But when we look at things which are highly correlated with poverty, like clean water, we see that sub-Saharan Africa is joined by Caucasus, Central Asia, by Oceania. Yeah. If we go to hunger, we can find again more regions are coming out as not having reached the goal. By the time we reach the one to do with employment, we find that we failed in each of our regions. So the success or failure of the Millennium Development Goals is a topic of some conversation. In a way, to promote the fact that we were successful, enabled us to have a second go, a second try with the Sustainable Development Goals. But to believe we were successful is totally to misunderstand what the globe succeeded in achieving. If you take the income one and see how it's fallen from 1990 to 2015, I thought they were agreed in 2000, didn't I say? Well, yes, but we took as our marker 10 years earlier, which is an interesting way of playing with statistics, isn't it? But you can see we've reduced the poverty rate globally from something like 35% to something like 12%. Successful. But if we take out China over the period of time, you can see that the line is much more horizontal rather than a cascading down. And China accounts for 51% of the fall in poverty that was achieved over that period of time. We'll come back and ask whether China was successful or not, because it's not as self-evident as those figures might suggest. But okay, qualified success. Well, what was it that explained the ability to reduce poverty over that period of time? Here's a little regression. The purple tells us the things that succeeded in helping reduce poverty. The pinks tell us what worked against that. Growth, economic growth, increasing GDP was critical, the top one. Change in median income, not just growth, but how it was distributed, was crucial in terms of reducing poverty. And those countries, and this is a bit of a fudge in a way, those countries which increased their rate of poverty reduction compared with the previous period were also those which were more likely to attain the goal. So if they did something as a country, as a government, then that also helped. Those that work against increasing inequality. Inequality erodes our ability to eradicate poverty. Sub-Saharan Africa, if you are a country there, you have much less chance of hitting your target than elsewhere. And those who received development assistance, i.e. international aid, those countries that received international aid over the period were less likely to succeed in eradicating poverty. Now, some scholars on the political right draw a causal connection. They got aid. Because they got aid, that made them all lazy as a government, and that's why they did not succeed in hitting the target. There's another story which says that aid goes to those countries which are have the least infrastructure, are most far behind the rest of the world in terms of the living standards that we're talking about. So we can interpret that in a number of ways. But if you take account of country size, I said a moment ago that China was responsible for effectively half of the fall. Well, what happens if we start to compare countries not China as against Bolivia, but in terms of their difference in population size. So in other words, if we add weights into our regression to cope with size, what happens? Well, we have some of the same things. Its growth, its change in median income are still there. So is inequality operating in the opposite way in sub-Saharan Africa. But we've also added in here least developed countries, those are furthest behind. We've got a poverty rate in 2000 where it was at the beginning. The lower it was, the less chance you had of eradicating poverty. Development assistance is still in there. Population, the larger your population, the less chance you had of reducing poverty. So China is very big, but it was only 21st in a rank order of countries in terms of its ability or its success in reducing per capita poverty. India is very large too, and was much less successful than China. The countries which are in the lead in terms of their ability to reduce poverty were countries such as Jordan and Fiji. Quite small countries were more successful than the larger ones. So scale matters, size matters. But we also saw there that the countries which were least successful were the countries that started with the highest poverty rate, who were further behind. And there's a sort of technical reason for this too, which we will refer to as we go through the talk. We have a couple of population distributions there, two countries, and we're plotting the number of people who's on income. And so they're that bell-shaped, relatively few, got big incomes, relatively few small, most of us somewhat in the middle. If we, and country B is richer than country A. Okay, so if we grow the richer country by a given amount, and then look at the number of people we lift across the poverty line, when we compare these two little bits down at the bottom, dare I move on here, these two little bits at the bottom, you see that the number lifted out exceeds the number who remain. Okay, we've shifted the whole distribution. No redistribution, just shifted it up, and some people move across the line as a consequence. If the poorer country grows by exactly the same amount, you will find the reverse situation. More are left behind than actually are lifted above. So the challenge, just technically, for a poor country to be successful is higher, it's harder than for a more affluent country. That only partly explains, it's not just a technical thing. If you're in a country without resources, in a country without infrastructure, it's patently obvious that the chance of lifting people up is going to be harder. But you've got this technical element there as well. In other words, the same goal is more difficult for some countries than others. And we have neglected to think about that as we've looked at the impact of the Millennium Development Goals. So I want now to move on to the Sustainable Development Goals, to return to the current era. Let me take a sip of water before my water that tastes of coffee. Caffeine helps. So the challenges of the goals that we confront. Okay, we've got countries on the left-hand side ranked in terms of their economic status, from high-income countries to low-income and then fragile conflict countries. And the first column tells us what the poverty rate was at the in 2015, the beginning of our Sustainable Development Goal era. And you can see they vary. Of course they vary, but they do vary substantially. Okay, and as what you can find, of course, is that higher income countries have less poverty than low income countries. It's not rocket science, as you might say. In the second column, we've looked at how successful countries were during the Millennium Development Goal era. And we've looked at how much poverty needs to happen to eradicate, how much poverty reduction needs to happen in order to eradicate poverty by 2030, okay? And so the 13.76 tells us that upper middle income countries were reducing poverty during the previous era by 13 times what it is necessary to reduce it in future. So in other words, if they continue in the way they were doing in the past, that eradicate poverty way before 2030, okay? So the task is not that great. It's greater for lower middle income countries, but even so, there's a high probability just drawing a straight line, doing what they did before, that they will succeed in hitting this goal. But what you clearly find, oh, and just add there, that you can do it, it's going to cost money, but it's not going to cost a great proportion of the gross domestic product of these countries, allowing for them to grow into the future. Okay, so it's a meaningful task. And for the upper middle income countries, for most of them, it's a cinch, you should do it. The story is radically different for the low income countries, the sub-Saharan countries, the ones that were falling behind during the Millennium Development Goals. They have to increase the rate of poverty reduction by a factor of 3 in order to hit their targets. So if they continue to do the same as before, and if the world continues largely to ignore them as it did before, we're not going to eradicate poverty by 2030 in those countries. And if we did try to do it, look how much more expensive it is in relation to the resources of those countries. The factor between the upper middle income countries, where it's 0.006% of GDP, compared with something like 5% of GDP, it's an enormous difference, okay? So some countries are almost bound to succeed and some aren't. But if we, in the global north, were prepared to contribute just 0.1% of our gross domestic product, which is 1/7 of what we agreed to do in 1970, we could eradicate poverty in low-income countries. So it's a big task for the countries themselves, but for us, it's a cinch, which is why we begin to connect with the world order to find some sort of structure which would enable us to redistribute resources in those sorts of ways. That was the first measure of poverty, poverty at $1.90 a day. There's another level, which is the average for high middle income countries, which is $5.5 a day, $5.50 a day. And the same story really comes. Upper middle income countries continue in the past, we should get there with no real problem. Even this higher level, higher middle income countries should reach. Doesn't work for those who are starting further behind. So it's the same story. You raise the poverty line, the same story. Those who are going to be successful will be successful. Those who aren't are not. But rich countries are also part of this game. We use relative measures of poverty. So how much is it going to cost us to reduce poverty? Fortunately, the United Kingdom isn't in that set of data for reasons I'm not 100% sure why, but you can see variability. So Iceland can halve relative poverty by spending another 0.5% of GDP, whereas New Zealand, sort of neoliberal country, although they made rather interesting statements, Prime Minister yesterday, laid that to one side, will have to spend 2.5% of GDP in order to hit the target. And I think we should do something about the people who are left behind too. Those who are still poor, shouldn't we reduce their level of their poverty, the severity of their poverty? So reducing the poverty gap, how far they fall beneath the poverty line by half, we get figures that look like that. Are they as attainable? Well, compare them with the target for low-income countries. We are expecting low-income countries to cough up 5.36% of their GDP to solve the problem of eradicating absolute poverty. Okay, so again, the pressure on the world is not equal. The goals don't mean the same thing. They are much easier for us, even halving relative poverty. So as we get richer, the numbers of people who are poor increases, but we can still redistribute or in other ways reduce the poverty line at much less cost than we are expecting low-income countries to spend on eradicating their poverty. Okay? So there are gross inequities in this picture of a sustainable development goals, the world working together. And this can be seen if you look at the third Sustainable Development Goal 1 target, which was about putting in place social protection. Okay, to put in place a baseline of social protection will cost low-income countries much more as a percentage of their growing GDP than it will for upper middle income countries, and high income countries would be even lower again. But they don't provide the statistics because we don't feel we have to do that because we've already got them in place. Again, there's some interesting questions when you think about the level of food poverty that we're beginning to encounter here in the United Kingdom. But we assumed it didn't matter for us. And in terms of the amount of tax increase on the current levels of taxes, we can see exactly the same. So low-income countries are going to have to increase the tax they take by between 40 and 45% in order to eradicate poverty. Whereas in the upper middle income countries, a 15% increase in taxation, just in simple redistribution. Now, there are other ways of tackling poverty rather than redistribution. Redistribution is a relatively simple way, but it tells the story. It tells the story that of the inequity in the system that we have. Okay, so these are why so little hope. The Millennium Development Goals, we didn't do as well as we think we did. In terms of the challenges of goals, relatively straightforward for high income and for upper middle income countries, but much, much more challenging for poorer countries. And then it takes us on to thinking about what are the causes of poverty. It's interesting to recognize that if you looked at the gross domestic products of countries in 1890 and asked, can we use those to predict the level of income now? The answer is yes, we can. We can explain 50% of the current variation in income by the situation in 1890, before this first wave of globalization in terms of the scramble for Africa and all that sort of colonial stuff. The legacy of history is stark in terms of the circumstances of countries at the moment. What this graph shows is a shorter period of time, 1950 to effectively the present. And we considered in 1950, average per capita incomes globally were about 3,000. They're now about 11,000. So we've experienced as a planet growing wealth. But if we plot on the USA, you can see it's much steeper, and Europe goes somewhere in between. And if you compare the difference between rich countries and the global average now compared with the past, you can see the difference is stark. Growing inequality is the characteristic of the last 70 years. Indeed, we can't fit the countries below the world average on the same axis and see them. They're all cramped down the bottom. So if we expanded a bit so we can see them and put in the global average, we find that Latin America was pretty much on the global average. It followed, broadly speaking, the same trend. We see that East Asia really took off. Japan, Korea, American money, and then China took off too. So we've seen a radical restructuring, reordering of the countries within the world. If we take South and South Asia, much less advanced, that's India following behind, China in the lead, I guess, although that's too political to actually really mention. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's hardly going up. It's hardly going up. Look at the comparison. Even within those countries that are below the global average, we can see radical differences. That's taking out South Africa, so it's even lower, okay? So history is important. A lot of people argue that policy is important too. The Washington Consensus, the neoliberal approach to economics, which said the state gets in the way. We need to free up economies to grow. We need to free up trade to grow. If you want money from the World Bank or the IMF, you have to restructure, structural readjustment. That means reducing the level of government spending and opening your economy to global trade. And people argue that that explains part of the growing inequality in our society, our global society. Didn't affect North America, who was preaching. The yellow bits, I hope they can be seen, is the key strong period of the Washington Consensus, and then its afterlife as it continued. Some might argue that it continues to 2020, but that's the sort of period that most people talk about. In Europe, we weren't affected because we didn't have to beg to the World Bank and to the IMF, broadly speaking, and Greece accepted. And we expanded our public welfare during that period of time, at the same time as low-income countries were being told to disassemble your welfare states. They're counterproductive. Latin America was badly affected because it was in debt. And as you can see, its trend of growth declined during that first 10-year period. It then invented conditional cash transfers, where you don't just give money to low-income people, but you make them change their behavior. If you change your behavior, if you don't get pregnant, if you put your kid in school, we'll give you some money, which is a rather neoliberal way of helping people. You change their behavior, you make them more market orientated, and the growth rate returned to its previous period. Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see what happened. Now, I'm drawing lines on a graph. They're not necessarily causal, but you can tell a causal story, and I try to in the pages of the book. Now, wouldn't it have been interesting had that line continued upwards? If we believe the welfare state erodes inequalities and helps low-income people, what did we do to Sub-Saharan Africa? People might argue in terms of policy. North Africa is a bit, doesn't fit stories very neatly, but I put it in there just to be honest. I don't know what was happening there. South and Southeast Asia, ignore what's happening with the West. Let's focus our investment on growth. Let's use the state to identify priorities and use the resources of the state to invest in sensible places and sensible things, and growth went up. So I've been talking about the challenges, much more difficult. We talked about causes, history. I haven't mentioned trade, but could. Global policy is another thing. So what are the possible policies? Well, let's think what we do in the ideal welfare state in the North. People work, market income. Not everybody can earn enough to live a sensible life. So we tax, and we use that tax creatively. We use that tax strategically to invest so that we can make the labour market more effective in terms of producing the wealth. And we put in place social protection, and both of those things affect outcomes, final outcomes. And we do that with national economic policy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we are conscious that that's a route that we can use. And we put in place national social policy. Well, the welfare state, one country. The Sustainable Development Goals relate to the world. Is it possible to adopt the same model globally? So, could we not think about the world in the same sort of way as we think about a national state? Couldn't we think about international trade reform, how we generate the income, and make that less inequitable? Increasing fiscal space for countries, to, in other words, make their own decisions, but to have the resources. It's very difficult for a low-income country to borrow. We're just spending billions by borrowing to cope with COVID and to cope with what's happening in Ukraine. You can do it because we have the reputation for being a high-income country. If you're a low-income country, you don't have that reputation. Can't we create a situation in which you did? What about global taxation? We tax in a country because we need the resources to spread those resources. What about globally? And some people argue that we should think about benefits globally too, that we should think about a global citizen's income, or some form of social protection fund. So in other words, a set of policies that we can operate nationally in order to address the problems that we have. Not the first to think about that. They're there in the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 17 talks about partnership. It talks about changing the trading system so that it's more open, non-discriminatory, more equitable multilaterally. And we talk about the Doha Development Agenda, which is the World Trade Organization, how trade is organized. Great hope was agreement that the rich countries would enable lower income countries to trade on equal terms. Doha collapsed in the very year that the Sustainable Development Goals were set up. That goal is meaningless because it is no Doha agreement or even a discussion about it. We've got another goal there, significantly to increase the exports of developing countries, and in particular, doubling the least developed countries' share of global exports by 2020, not 2030. This is one which is brought forward for some reason. By 2020, we need to double. You can see those lines are flat. They should be going up vertically or close to vertically because we're doubling. So we failed already in terms of doing anything about global trade, the way that we as a society, global society, generate resources. What about welfare state? Overseas development aid is a way of rich countries giving, almost charitable giving, to the developing world, okay? We've got, as it says there, reminding countries that in 1970, they agreed to devote 4.7% of their GDP to overseas development aid. We've missed it a long time, but we're going to do it now. That's what the goal says. It says do it by 2030. It gives us an extra 15 years. Those are the only countries that have ever achieved that. The United Kingdom is there, but we've removed it. Why? Oh, we're suffering from COVID, aren't we? The development world isn't. We've removed it. Development aid? I don't know. Okay, well, what about benefits? What about cost of putting benefits in place? What about a global citizen's income? People have talked quite a lot about basic income. That's giving everybody an amount of money, everybody rich and poor. And we see it in place in Alaska. Okay, we see it being trialed in Ireland at the moment. And we have a large-scale experiment that was done in Finland. And lots of advocates, not all of them mad, have suggested that we do this globally, that we give everybody an income. And in particular, Grimalda and a team have worked this out in some degree of detail. And they have a series of stages. So they say, well, let's give everybody the basic poverty rate, $1.9 a day, everybody, and then they can build upon it. But they've got some safety net in their lives. And we can see they start with restricting it to the lower half of low middle income countries, when it would cost somewhat under 1% of global GDP. If you expand it right through, it's costing about 3%. But what about increasing the poverty threshold? This is 3.2. This is the average for lower middle income countries. If we gave $3 a day to everybody, it would cost something about 5.5% of global GDP. But then everybody would have a threshold, a baseline upon which they could build. They could afford to take risks in the economy or in training or whatever, is the logic that underpins a global citizen's income. But that may be considered to be too radical, giving people money for nothing. So we return to social protection, give people assistance and need and help when they need it. And so we have the notion of a social protection floor. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has been promoting this since 2012. And how much would it cost? Well, if it would cost on the average of the GDP of low income and middle income countries, about 1.5% of GDP. And you notice it falls over time. That's because the baseline is COVID related. It's the decline in income that happened in 2020. That's cash benefits for pensions, for children, for unemployment, and for old age. If I said that, I'm not sure. That set of benefits. If you added in healthcare, you would need to add another 1% to the overall cost. Okay, a social protection floor. That's what the ILO has been arguing for. Can't we do it? Well, we need some money, don't we? So let's think about how we could raise some money. Let's think about a global wealth tax. The people who have large amounts of money, couldn't we tap on them? It's the sort of Robin Hood notion. It's the idea of the left. Let's get those rich people to help us rather than to exploit us. And there's lots of attempts at estimating how much you could raise. And you can see that they are ranging between 3% of global GDP. The minimum is SACS at about 0.3. Those figures are comparable with the figures that we've been talking about for the citizen's income, or for the more than for the basic social protection. Financial transactions tax. I think Grimalda rather overestimates the amount that could be raised through that. And then there's a carbon tax. We could use it now. It's going to decline over time, hopefully, as we reduce the amount of carbon we use. But there are resources there, which are new resources, which aren't currently tapped, that we could use to finance a global welfare state. What's in the way? It sounds simple. The money's there. Why don't we just use it in order to fulfill the goals that we've established as a globe and agreed to, and celebrate in big events in 2015 how the world was going to come together? The architects of the Sustainable Development Goals weren't, of course, stupid. They realized that there were real challenges ahead, like the vested interests of rich countries and rich companies who don't want to give that money away. The global trade system is fantastic. It takes money from the poor into the pockets of the rich. I'm rich, I love that. You're rich, you love that, but you're probably not aware of the extent to which you are living off the low incomes of people in the global south. So they turned to we the people. The view was that those big industry won't come along. We've got to get everybody, you and I, yelling for global change. Their document was called We the People, a play upon, of course, on the original document for the United Nations, which is We the Nations come together to build global peace and global economy. So let's think about we the people. Let's go back to overseas development aid, global charity. Where does it come from? It comes from countries which are social democratic, countries which in a sense believe that solidarity is a central component binding society together. And it appears to go beyond the boundaries of Denmark and Norway and Sweden. The argument is they care for people outside those countries as well. And as you can see, countries differ significantly in terms of the proportions of income that goes on overseas development aid. And within countries, the support for helping poor people, for putting in place a minimum income benefit. As you can see, 40 to 60, even 80% of people support such a policy until you ask them, are they prepared to pay for it? And as you can see, their enthusiasm wanes when it means, what, me, Gov? I've got to put my hand in my pocket. And you could, but nevertheless, we've got some degree of support. But do you believe globally that the voice of you and I is going to be strong enough to the big industry and to the rich countries? We are part of those rich countries after all. So I'm not sure that we the people is going to take us as far as the architects of the Sustainable Development Goals believed it would and could. We have to reform institutions. Lots of people have thought about it. I'm using Lopez and Claris's 2020 work. We look to the United Nations, and what do we find? The United Nations, which represents a fossil image of what the world was like in 1945, with the world's victors in control in the Security Council. Russia's a bit of a problem at the moment, but essentially it looks like the world did. The General Assembly is powerless. The argument is we need to restructure and give legitimacy to the General Assembly, which is the only place the world gets together to talk about common goals and common challenges. We should think about, can we make it democratic? The model they use is the European Parliament. Can we do something like that for the United Nations to take the voice of the people into the hall of decision-taking? Replace the Security Council, not with a bickering group of 5 permanent members and selected others, but turn it into an executive council that works for the decisions taken in the General Assembly rather than the other way around. So we create some sort of global democracy. Well, I hear people saying, well, we can't have China represented there because it's authoritarian. One of the wonderful things about the United Nations founding document is it says nothing about forms of government, okay? Everybody was part of the United Nations. Can we turn it into a body that functions? Bill of Rights, we need new funding resources, etc. They also argue that we need to shift the balance from the fiscal organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bretton Woods organizations, and shift it to the United Nations. If we can't do that, we need to do something about the Bretton Woods organizations. The United States has a veto on all decisions taken within the World Bank and within the IMF, and it uses it. What is the legitimacy of that? Shouldn't we take account of the fact that lots of countries have grown since 1945 in terms of their economic power? Shouldn't we respond to that? And of course, I say, of course, my view is that we should. They also argue that perhaps we should have something attached to the United Nations. The expectation was the United Nations would have an economic wing. It never actually happened because the IMF and the World Bank, protected by Britain and the United States, who didn't want global involvement, resisted that. Can we move to a situation where we do have part of the UN whose responsibility is to think globally? To do that, however, given the vested interests, we perhaps have to challenge the ideology. Director General of the United Nations is already challenging that. I don't know anybody is actually hearing him. The global financial system is morally bankrupt. It favors the rich and it punishes the poor. The beginning of his declaration in January of this year. And he goes on about the negative consequences. But what we have is just what we social scientists would expect. A neo-realist global world in which nation states see themselves as in continuing competition. They all want to be the top dog. Security, economic, financial, and leverage is best assured if you become the dominant individual, if you become the United States. And anarchy suits the powerful. The rich don't want rules. Rules are invented and laws are invented to protect the powerless, not the powerful. We don't want to change the system. The Brits don't want to change the system, especially since we've left Europe. We're now going to be on that global stage. We want to hold on to our seat in the Security Council. What right do we have for that seat? Okay, so we need to reform the ideology. What might it look like? More inclusive global governance, I think, more effective multilateral mechanisms, more active regional cooperation, build a community with a shared future for mankind, solidarity and cooperation between people of the world, peaceful development, welfare for all humanity, allowing countries, different social systems and ideologies and histories and cultures to come together with shared interests, shared rights, and shared responsibilities, etc. It's a bit like the Sermon on the Mount from the Bible, isn't it? It's about all these good things. Can we actually challenge that? Isn't that the world that would enable us to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals? I think it probably is. It's Xi Jinping's speech to the United Nations at the end of last year. The leader of the Chinese Communist Party, strictly the leader of the Chinese government. The BBC never makes that distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. They are not the same. But that's the Chinese vision. I don't know whether I believe it, but the words strike me as being the only solutions that I've come up with to successfully achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. And I'm only looking at one, SDG 1. I think there's very little hope of attaining it. I think individual countries, as I hope I have demonstrated, those low-income countries can't do it alone. We need some form of global governance and global policy. We've got the resources. Resources isn't the question. It's political will that is the problem. To get there, we have to challenge the world order. And I don't know that people are listening, and I don't know how that can be done. So what, if anything, can be done? I had to find some positive finish, which is a global social protection fund. You've seen this chart before. We were focusing on what we could do if we put social protection in place. The special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur on human rights and poverty, has suggested that we should put in place a social protection fund that protects low-income countries. You can see what a small amount of expenditure it is compared with the things we're talking about. It's negligible. At the moment, it's being resisted as being too generous. And even that, the international funding will fall over time as those countries continue to grow. Surely we can do something. I rest my case. Surely we must do something.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think, yeah, we probably have some time to
I apologize for
Yeah.
talking too long.
That is quite, I really thank you very much for your very extensive and deep sharing of the lecture. Now I don't doubt you can go into 4 hours. Any question for audience?
It relates more to kind of European policy, but what do you think of the whole framework of social investment? Do you see that as like a justifiable route out of poverty, or do you see it more as kind of a neoliberal individualistic, because the more I read about it, the more I'm kind of like, to me, this sounds like an excuse because not everyone has the same resources. So investing in kind of lifelong education and learning, lifelong transition.
I write books to learn. I knew nothing much about this when I started. That I have to write another book on that. But broadly speaking, when I looked at it, first of all, that's my feeling. If you look where it's come from, its sources are pretty much to the political right. Yes, investment's important, but there's a question of who's in control of investment. Who can shape that investment? Who's monitoring that investment? And for whose purpose is that investment? I think those are the sorts of questions I would want to ask about the broader investment strategy. The trouble is we still do have a neoliberal agenda dominating much of our economic discourse. And to challenge that, even if you have to camouflage it with words or whatever, so some, I think, of the people who put it forward were passionate about this as a route. Others saw it as a route that could at least open the door to thinking about a role, a communal role for national development or European development in that case. So I think the more ideas we have around, the better. What I find difficult is for these ideas to really leak out of universities. There's nothing, I've said nothing new in my talk. I have discovered a lot in writing the book, things I didn't know before, but there's nothing really, really new. But we have a world where we are almost bound not to be successful. And whereas, well, maybe like the UN in 2015 found a way of producing a green map rather than a red map, we will do the same thing in 2030. And at some level, I don't really object to that. Well, why can't we actually do what we said we can do, given that we have the resources? Sorry, that was a weak rant.
I'd like to ask on the criteria, like as in India also, I'm from India.
Yeah.
So the income criteria of measuring poverty is the calorie-based one. Which one do you feel is a more apt?
I think poverty is a political concept. There are very few politicians who get elected by saying, I'm going to increase poverty, vote for me. Margaret Thatcher here got very close to that. She said the power of the trade union movement is too strong. We need to put pressure on them, and that meant increasing unemployment. But broadly speaking, we all want to eradicate poverty. So the central thing, it's very much political. When you go to talk to people who are experiencing poverty, they experience it in a very multidimensional way. So calorific might be translated into feeling hungry. As a mum, not eating so that my children can eat. Lots of work has shown that low-income people are very good at maximizing the calorific intake given a given amount of money. So they're not stupid in that sense, but it's not the way they feel about it. They feel about poverty being poverty is a lack of resources and its immediate consequences, which are felt simultaneously. And in work that I was involved in, looking at 7 countries with ATD Fourth World, which is an NGO, came up with 9 dimensions of poverty that people thought were central to their lives. And food was one of them. So I don't think there's one measure. I think we should think about multiple measures. There's 2 challenges with multiple measures. One is, if you've got lots, a scoreboard, any government can defend itself by picking the indicator that looks most positive, right? Equally, those lobbying can change, can pick the others, but there's no consensus. And then the second one is how you weight the dimensions. How would you weight calorific intake against lack of education? They are difficult to put together. And actually, there's a lot of academic work really needs to be done on that. At the moment, all our multiple measures are simply additive rather than any real serious consideration of weights. So there's a, so we've got a political concept of poverty, we've got a technical concept of poverty, and we've got an experiential concept of poverty. And we've got a third, which is what people who aren't poor think poverty is. And in my view, that's our biggest problem. People who aren't poor have a very convenient story. I'm not poor, and I'm not poor because I worked really hard at school. I took the right decisions. I didn't use drugs, get myself pregnant. I'm just a sensible, straightforward guy or lady, and I'm successful. Those who are poor did all those things which I didn't do, and that's why they're poor. And that justifies the existing social structure. And that's why it's going, in my view, it's so challenging to think about we the people, when we the people don't really want to understand that much, perhaps. Sorry, long-winded answer, and I didn't quite answer, but I think I put it in context.
The other part is on entitlements. Entitlements of social security is a form of entitlement.
Yeah.
Well, poverty, if we want to eradicate it, that has an element of empowerment. So that is like the difference.
Absolutely.
Absolute difference.
Yeah, I think empowerment is critical. And I think, I have several Indian PhD students when I was here. And so I'm in this notion of an Indian constitution, which enshrines these principles within a legal framework. I don't know how far I buy into those entitlements because they're not delivered. If they were delivered, then I would have some more confidence. But we have to have a language, and at least India has a language, and therefore some form of accountability. The Sustainable Development Goals are in some sense meant to be measures of accountability, but really, it becomes an intellectual exercise to see that some countries get out of poverty and others don't. It requires real policy. And my argument is that we have to do that collectively in order to successfully think. So India and China for that matter are beginning to think about South-South development aid, etc. And that's where we should be going, or one of the ways we should be going. But there's also a sense at which you don't look at yourselves, you look at other countries. Yeah. And then, like Britain, in this latest paper on overseas development aid, you only look at, we will make our aid conditional on the fact that they purchase our goods. I have not seen such a disgusting document as the one that has currently gone into law here. That's not my view. It's certainly not what development aid is about, and I don't think it's what global governance is about. But equally, those neo-realist political scientists say that is exactly what the political process, the global process, is about.
Thank you so much.
You talked a lot about vested interests. I just wanted, when you sort of talk about global reform, where you see the power of multinational corporations fitting in, some having, larger incomes than many countries,
Yeah.
And their vested interests are challenged.
Yeah, they are. They are indeed. Chapter 6, I think, is where I struggle with that, and struggle with ownership, struggle with networks of influence. And the figures are dramatic. You're right that it depends a bit how you measure it, but some of the multinationals have have their own gross domestic product, which is far greater than some quite large national concerns. And now you're back to this question of accountability. I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult for a scholar like me, coming broadly new to an area, to get a real understanding of the interrelationships between commerce, business, enterprise, and countries. It strikes me that there's a symbiotic relationship between the two, and foreign policy is often commercial, mercantile policy, and the concept of the national interest strikes me as being one which is equally open to challenge in terms of that. But you're absolutely right, and there's quite interesting positioning of China in this regard. You know, there's around this whole trade debate. It's essentially, we have a global trade system that favors the global north, and we have a sort of neoliberal structure of thought which favors commerce as opposed to government. So we should free enterprise to maximize income. And we've had a conversation about the East Asia, Korea, Japan initially, using state resources to focus on development. And so there was this close partnership with the state directing industry, and it's proven to be successful. There are some scholars on the left who argue that's exactly what America actually does. When you actually look at the investment in America, driven first of all by defense, and secondly by IT, you see that most of the developmental investment that's achieved by American industry is funded by the American government, okay? Which juxtaposes China, which does exactly the same thing, but says it does exactly the same thing. What China has done with its state directing it is to add itself to the list of owners of global wealth. So there's a chart in the book, and I can't remember the details, but it looks at 4 dimensions of influence in terms of the global trade system. And it ranks companies and it ranks countries within the same list. And there are different ways in which you can influence decision taking. You know, you can sell your shares or you can be actively involved. And you find China in 5 places. I think it's 3 petroleum companies and 2 state sovereign funds, alongside Norway and Saudi Arabia and a handful of other countries. So you've got a very interesting composition of people or organizations who have a big financial stake in the global economy. I write quite a lot on global politics at the moment because I've been so offended living in China, how China is distorted through the Western lens. It's got lots of problems, lots of issues that I would take, but it's this global distortion. And America is deeply scared of China because it's a competitor. It's intrigued me that there hasn't been much debate yet about how much of the world China actually owns. You know, there's a discourse that the last the Great Recession was actually triggered in some sense by China. In China, people were saving at a fantastic rate. China doesn't spend. People have got this legacy of looking after themselves, of providing a safety net. So vast amounts of savings as the economy grew. And those savings entered the world economy and kept down cost of borrowing. And with a cost of borrowing low, companies in America were able to fund what were they called, the dodgy loans in the housing market. That money came from China. It wasn't a deliberate strategy for China to undermine the American economy, but it's an interesting possibility if this global competition is pushed further, that China is in that sort of position. But the fact that it's in that sort of position, and also talking about using the words that I took as being, broadly speaking, positive, I don't know whether it's at all possible to use China's wealth to actually fulfill the sorts of goals that they're talking about. So in other words, to turn to China and say, this is what you say, let's back it with your financial influence. I know what would happen. China would get accused of financial diplomacy, like vaccine diplomacy, you know, but it's a possibility to think about. India's a bit further behind in terms of concentrating its growing wealth in a way that could be used in that sort of way, I think.
Yeah, right.
What are your thoughts on the role of education in all of this? And the reason I ask this is because I'm thinking of Beveridge's response in the 1930s. One of the wars of wants was ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Tony Blair, the neoliberal,
Right.
not a socialist at all, referred to education.
Right.
So I think he had a completely different agenda from that and Beveridge. So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile the role of neoliberals in education with that of education with a different function in mind, which would be that of enabling recipients to understand how the world works, as opposed to being productive in that world through education?
I think education is central. I think if there'd been weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Blair would not be considered neoliberal. I think if you look at the actions of the Labour government in the 1990s and to a certain extent into the 2000s, you will find it's not. And education was pretty important, pretty central. I think education is critically important and very complicated and not my area of expertise. It strikes me as being critically important in the takeoff of economies. You've seen that in China, and you've seen that in Africa. Your problem is to capitalize on that and to stop education becoming a mechanism of reproduction of inequalities. And what we've reached in much of the Western world is that education merely replicates the inequalities that are there. Using the word ignorance, as Beveridge did, it was antiquated in our language and has so many different meanings. But picking up on ignorance in the sense of not knowing and I would add in misunderstanding, then I think global education is fundamentally important. And one of the ways of talking about effective democracy is to think about the so-called fourth estate. And the fourth estate historically has been the media, has been the press, the print press originally, and subsequently the more traditional forms of mass media, radio and television, which has been seen as a way of holding governments to account, to be able to identify the weaknesses and praise the strengths. There's an extent to which the media has increasingly become only interested in the negativity, but nevertheless it's there. There is no such corresponding system in the global debate. The reason I'm at Harvard at the moment was I was there last year, but virtually, and I looked at the media coverage of the origins of COVID, and I compared media coverage in American newspapers, in Australian newspapers, in British newspapers, and their associated websites, and also the Chinese media, and looked at how it was covered. I'm happy to share that there's a paper published by Harvard University which looks at that. And it essentially, you obviously had different stories. We know you had different stories, and it was kind of try and tease out why you had different stories. Sort of negativity bias sells newspapers in a commercial sector, etc. You found that correspondents who were placed in China had a much more positive story than those who were writing editorials back in Washington and New York. But there was partiality in that media. As I said earlier, living in China, the partiality leaps out at me whenever I turn on the BBC. The world that I'm living in, I do not see. How we can create a level of knowledge at a global scale that could intersect with the sorts of things I'm talking about, which is where I see the potential for education. I think it's an enormous challenge, but I think we are hemmed in. We're hemmed in by ignorance and by self-interest. Ignorance informed can perhaps help challenge self-interest. So it's a long way from education, or this focus on what schools and universities can supply. But it's about public education, about our understanding of the world in which we live, which I think is where we should go. Thank you for that. I haven't thought about that issue before. It's important.
In this context, it's absolutely completely.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your wonderful discussion. I think we are running quite over the time. Yeah, I really thank you, Professor Walker, for your wonderful sharing of all the facts, policy, and also I'm quite inspired by the way you see it. And we need a collective and coordinated way of global collaboration in doing something together in the multi-text context of this problem. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for helping.